On BBC Two, tackle the day's political talking points.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative Party Vice Chair Andrew Bowie, Scottish Labour leadership candidate Monica Lennon, Daily Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant, and The Guardian columnist and campaigner George Monbiot. Today, we're waiting for a roadmap out of COVID restrictions, but the scientists say this.
Data is what's going to be important. The virus isn't going to be particularly interested in dates.
They reformed the health service in 2012. Now the current health secretary says it's time to reverse.
This landmark white paper builds on what colleagues in health and care have told us, and we will continue that engagement in the weeks ahead.
Being the Labour leader in Scotland hasn't exactly provided job security. This MSP tells us why she wants to win. We already tax sources of carbon like this. So, should we also tax things like this? So, as we said, we know the government is publishing a roadmap week after next for when we may see restrictions being eased out of the pandemic. Now, people understandably will want to know what's being set out, but Director of the Wellcome Trust, Jeremy Farrar, cautioned against being too specific. Here he is.
It is not sensible to set a date by which you're going to lift restrictions. Those restrictions can be lifted and they will be lifted, but only when the data allows that to be true. Setting a date now arbitrarily for some date in March or April, frankly, doesn't make any sense.
So, Andrew, is it too early to specify a roadmap starting the week of the 22nd?
Well, yes. I mean, the government has said all along we are listening to the scientists and the best medical advice, and we're not about to set arbitrary dates and deadlines. But what the Prime Minister is going to do on the 22nd of February is give an indication of what targets need to be reached and when, so we can look at reducing and relaxing the restrictions. I think all of us, business especially, need to have some sort of clear roadmap as to how and when we are going to move back down through the levels, back to a place where we are functioning as close to normal as possible.
Well, that sounds like dates. That sounds like dates and timescales.
Yeah, but we're giving no concrete dates or timescales. What we are saying is we're looking at the data, we're listening to the medical advice, and we're not going to be taking any steps until the indicators are such that we're in as safe a position as possible to move back down through the restrictions. So.
Right, so the week after next, we won't get any clear indication of when we're going to come out of this pandemic in terms of restrictions.
What the Prime Minister will be doing is setting out a programme, an idea of how and when we want to get where we need to be to let the restrictions be eased. I think that's all we can do right now. That's what business needs. They need to know the targets that we need to be hitting to enable us to move back down through the restrictions and get this country back functioning as close to normality as possible.
Now, Monica, many people in England, parents specifically, will be watching enviously as some primary school children and some secondary school children, not many, I know, but they'll return to school in Scotland on February the 22nd. But is it too soon?
Well, that's the plan, and it has to be informed by data and evidence. So I think on the whole, the public want to have as much certainty and clarity as possible. But I think more than that, they want governments across the UK, including the Scottish Government, to play their part fully. So you can publish a roadmap and a plan, and that's good. But what you have to do is the hard work every day. So when we see testing capacity going unused, when we see vaccines going in the bin, when we see contact tracing not working very well, it doesn't matter how hard the public try to play by the rules. If government are not doing their job, that makes it easier, or that makes it harder to ease restrictions. So people want to look ahead and look to the summer and think about holidays and so on. But right now, community transmission is still too high. And I'm really concerned, Joe, about PPE. We're seeing in Scotland hospital onset COVID increasing more than in the first wave, and there's big concerns that our PPE standards are not keeping up with what we know about the virus and the emerging variants. And that's a concern that needs to be addressed at a UK level.
OK. Madeleine, you have written and said that yesterday's briefing was a news conference without news. On the basis of what we're hearing, you might have to get used to that. I
think so. And in fact, I sketched this. I sketched that conference yesterday, but I feel like I've sketched it many a time before. This is becoming quite a fixture where the government will stand up and give the latest figures and perhaps an update on where they're at with vaccinations, which is good because it's morale boosting. But there won't be any particular policy change that is signalled or any sense of when we might be getting out of the lockdown situation that we're in. And in general, I have noticed a lot of mixed messages. I mean, I understand completely why it's hard to put a firm date on these things with so much up in the air. But I think the government does need to at least give people a sense of the criteria that you might have for lifting, because there are so many mixed messages going on. You know, initially many people, I think, held the expectation that we might start to plan to loosen restrictions once the elderly and the vulnerable had been vaccinated. Now, many seem to be calling for the entire population to be vaccinated or to go further and further down that list. And there are some MPs calling for a zero COVID strategy of total elimination. And the threat of mutant strains seems to be enough to not just to justify domestic lockdown continuing, but also to justify a kind of permanent state of Fortress Britain where you can't allow foreign travel coming into this country. So I think, you know, they need to be more straight with the public on this. We need to discuss what level of hospitalisation we could live with, what level of daily death from the virus could we live with, rather than doing this what I think is very bad comms thing of constantly saying, you know, we're at the final furlong now, and then changing the date, pushing it back, removing certainty from people. At least be straight with people about what living with the virus would look like and how we might get there.
Well, George, how do you see it? I mean, it's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? I mean, we've heard there really from Andrew too about, yes, we're going to have this announcement about a roadmap for the future. I mean, how specific do you think the government should be?
Well, it's not the dates the government should be publishing, it's the criteria. And it is frankly unbelievable that in this third lockdown, it still has published no criteria for how and when lockdown ends. Indeed, it's never published a full strategic plan for dealing with the pandemic. So what it ought to be saying is, right, here's the R number we need to reach. Here's the rate of hospitalisation we need to reach. Here's the death rate we need to reach before we relax the lockdown. But without those firm criteria published so that we can all debate them, we can see them, we can debate them, we can throw evidence into the mix. Without that, we'll end up with this constant reactive politics where the government thinks, oh, you know, it's getting a bit hot now. People are really beginning to chafe against this lockdown. Let's release the lockdown, relax the measures. People can go back to normal, and then bang, we get the pandemic taking off again. Now, that's happened 3 times already, and we will be trapped in a constant cycle of lockdown relaxation, unless the government has a clear plan with clear criteria attached to that plan.
All right, I'm going to let Andrew just briefly respond before we move on.
Well, it's specifically what George references there, the relaxation and the pandemic sprouting again and beginning to, and COVID transmitting more across the country that we want to avoid, which is why we are so desperately keen to increase the number of people vaccinated before we take any further steps. The Prime Minister will be making clear the plans of the government regarding lockdown and the criteria that must be reached on February the 22nd. Until that point, we must urge everybody who is able to get a vaccine to do so. There are still 2 million over 70s in England who have yet to get their vaccine. We would urge them to contact the NHS, go online or call 119 and find out how they are able to get that vaccine, because the more people that are vaccinated, the quicker we can move down the route of relaxing and getting this country back to normal. Nobody wants to live in Britain. Everybody wants to get back to normal as soon as possible. We can only do it when it's safe.
All right, we're going to leave it there, because one thing the government is discussing, which may be surprising to some viewers, is a reorganisation of the NHS. Let's listen to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, today.
The White Paper is built on more than 2 years of work with the NHS, local councils and the public. At its heart, This white paper enables greater integration, reduces bureaucracy, and supports the way that the NHS and social care work when they work at their best together.
So that's Matt Hancock talking about the NHS in England and scrapping the reforms of a previous Conservative-led government under David Cameron and the then Health Secretary Andrew Lansley. Andrew, after all the years of upheaval, time, energy and money that was spent on that reorganisation of the NHS under David Cameron, now they are reversing it and scrapping those reforms. Should Matt Hancock start with an apology?
Absolutely not. And we're not reversing and scrapping the reforms. We're looking at how best to shape the NHS in England for the coming decade, learning, as we have done, what functions best and what doesn't function very well under the severe strain that it's been through in this pandemic. I think that this is specifically and precisely the right time that we should be addressing these issues as we look to make social care better across the rest of the United Kingdom, as we look to make the NHS more integrated, cut back on their bureaucracy, get rid of so much red tape and make it more accountable to taxpayers. I think this is exactly what the people of the United Kingdom would like to see their government doing, would like to see their health service
I don't know what
I
don't know what you're basing the evidence that they'd like to see it right now in the middle of a pandemic. But Madeleine, Matt Hancock has said, a little bit like Andrew Bowie, this is the right time for a reorganisation of the NHS. Should he go further?
With the reorganisation?
Yes.
I mean, I think that they should be thinking very carefully. They should be, if anything, I think the risk right now is moving too quickly. I think there are many ministers who are anxious. They're thinking of the coming public inquiry into how the NHS has responded to this crisis. And they're anxious that they might be blamed for some of the problems in the NHS. And some people are, therefore wanting to push ahead with this. But I think there is a risk of a big opportunity being wasted here if they were to move too quickly. And in general, the conversation that we're currently allowed to have around the NHS is an incredibly narrow and limited one. Anyone who even suggests looking abroad at how things are managed in other countries that seem to have weathered the pandemic storm rather better than the NHS has are shrieked down and howled down and accused of maligning individual healthcare workers. So I feel like we've got a bad intellectual environment for a shake-up of the NHS. And I think that the incentives that are currently spurring on the politicians into doing this aren't particularly right either. I think, if anything, we need to wait for the dust to settle and have a really more holistic look around the world at what has worked and what hasn't.
Right. I mean, George, are you optimistic that these proposals by Matt Hancock may herald a new dawn for the NHS?
Well, I think we should be extremely suspicious of any Tory reorganisation of the NHS because it always seems mysteriously to end up with more privatisation and more outsourcing. And if there's one thing we've seen in the pandemic, it's what a total disaster privatisation and outsourcing are. Take a look at test and trace, for example.
Is that what Matt Hancock is suggesting now?
We'll see, because when many of us opposed the so-called reorganisation by Andrew Lansley and David Cameron, we were told, oh, don't worry at all. There's absolutely, we're not privatising the NHS. Absolutely, we're not doing any more outsourcing. And of course, it turned out that that's exactly what they were doing. And as many of us predicted at the time, it was a disaster. Now, of course, if Hancock wants to reverse that reorganisation, that would be a good thing. But, look out for the small print. And, we've seen, for instance, with the test and trace fiasco in this country, where it was handed over to dilettantes and implemented by corporations with a disastrous track record of delivery, instead of being run by the NHS. And as a result, we do not have a functional test and trace system in this country. That's what we desperately need to avoid.
All right, well, I'll come back to the experience of the test and trace. But first of all, Andrew Bowie, do you now regret increasing the amount of competitive tendering within the NHS under the Andrew Lansley reform? Should there be more or less private outsourcing?
Look, I think that all of this will have to be discussed in the round, but exactly what we are outlining today is actually bringing more of the operation of the NHS in-house, directly accountable to government and therefore accountable to the taxpayer. We are absolutely not going down the route of outsourcing more or increasing privatisation, despite the shrill cries from many. We are focused on reforming the NHS to make it more accountable to the people that it serves. And making it work better, not just for the people that use it, but for the amazing NHS staff that are working in it. And I think that's absolutely what this government should be focused on as we move through the pandemic and rebuild the health service to face the challenges of the 2020s and beyond. The reforms in the early 2010s were very much focused on dealing with the NHS as it was then. We have moved a long way, especially over the last 12 months, and now we have to look hard at how we rebuild the NHS and make it better for the people of Britain as we move forward.
I mean, Monica, Labour has always thought of itself as the party of the NHS, and yet despite what many people will see as failed reforms in 2012 to the health service in England, the Tories keep winning elections. Why?
Well, the NHS in Tory hands is never a good place to be. The Tories should be worried about the forthcoming public inquiry, because not just in England but in Scotland too, our public services were not well prepared for a pandemic, and that's why the public inquiries have been kicked into the long grass. This talk about reorganisation is interesting, but what NHS staff need today are resources to do their jobs and to do them safely, to keep themselves safe and the people they care for. In Scotland, we have integration between health and social care, but it's been done on the cheap. So you end up getting delayed discharge building up because there isn't the resource in the community for people to be safely cared for in their own homes or in social care. So again, we can throw around some buzzwords, but unless you properly invest in the workforce and develop the workforce and listen to staff when they are saying that they are exhausted, they're burnt out. In Scotland, I know that mental health-related illness and absence in the NHS have never been higher, and that wasn't just during the pandemic. That was before. So
you've painted a very sorry picture of what's going on in Scotland, but yet the SNP still keep winning there.
Yeah, well, it is bleak.
Right.
Our NHS is struggling.
But somehow you're not capitalising on it, are you?
Well, we're going to talk about Scottish Labour, I'm sure, at some point, and I'm glad because we need to change as a party, because when we're not in the game of winning elections, it gets left to the Tories and the SNP to run our public services, and they've been running them into the ground. So that's why I'm standing, Jo, to try and change that.
Yes, I know, but people obviously don't agree with you on that, do they, in Scotland?
Well, people are voting for particular parties for many reasons. If you want to talk about Scotland, then the SNP have been in power since 2007.
Sure.
They came in a wave full of promises. So they promised to give people a guarantee to treatment within 12 weeks, and they've broken that promise hundreds of thousands of times. So, you know, we need to look at their record, but absolutely Labour in Scotland needs to have a positive offer to the electorate. And that's why I want to actively listen to communities, all those people who feel that Labour has not been there for them when they need them.
Well, you're right, we are. We're just about to talk about it, but I'm just going to let Madeleine back in on this discussion before we move on.
Sure. I think what Monica gets at, I mean, she seems to imply that the one issue that the health service faces is a shortage of money. And I think there's some truth to that. The NHS is underfunded compared to many comparable health services around the world. But I think it's very important that these reforms go to the heart of the structural problems with the NHS. It's incredibly centralised. It's incredibly process-driven. You know, healthcare ends up it's decided by ministers, overseen by bureaucrats, and you often end up with healthcare being rationed. I think fundamentally, this is not a system at that level, managing so much from the top down, being such an enormous employer of people, this kind of behemoths system, that it's going to yield good results.
Right, we're going to move on and talk about exactly what Monica was suggesting, which is the Labour leadership election going on in Scotland. We'll know the result by the 27th of February. Now, last month we spoke to the other contender, Anas Sarwar, and as I say, we're going to talk to Monica Lennon about it too. We're also going to speak to the SNP, MSP Shona Robertson, in just a moment. But first of all, what has attracted you to the job that has seen off 6 leaders in 14 years since Labour was in government in Scotland, Monica?
It's an opportunity to change the way we do politics. We've just heard about what happens to public services when Labour is out of government. So we're not here to be a protest party. We need to be a party that's ready for government. And in Scotland, we've spent too long being angry at ourselves, angry at the SNP, angry at voters. So in the Scottish Parliament, we were last in government in 2003. We came out of power in 2007. We've been losing elections for quite a long time, Joe, so that needs to change. And I don't believe that we've learned lessons from the 2014 referendum on independence, because although people in Scotland voted to remain in the Union, they weren't voting for the status quo. They weren't voting for things to be normal. Andrew talked about going through COVID and going back to normal. Normal is very unequal. So people in Scotland want to see radical change. They want social reform and economic reform.
All right.
And at the moment, they felt that the only choice is between the SNP offering independence and the Tories offering more of the same. But I think there's a majority in the middle.
Right, if you don't mind me interrupting, Monica, on that and on the issue of independence and another independence referendum, that's going to be the dominant theme in the elections in May. Explain to us what your policy is, personally, towards a second independence referendum.
Well, I don't believe in independence. I believe in devolution, and I believe we should be using the powers in the Scottish Parliament more fully, more progressively, but also there are areas where further power should be devolved from Westminster to Holyrood. But what I recognise is, Joe, that it is still a dominant issue, and people in Scotland want to have a debate and a discussion. And what I'm saying to Scottish Labour colleagues and members is, don't sit on the sidelines, be part of this, show there's an alternative, because if we leave it just to the SNP and the Tories, we could end up with a binary referendum between yes and no, which is very divisive. So any future referendum, if there's going to be one, and that should be for people in Scotland to decide for themselves, not for Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer or any Prime Minister, but we should open out that question, because I think there is a majority of people who want change and want to see more powers like employment law come to Scotland. We can increase the minimum wage, get rid of the Tories' anti-trade union acts.
Let me just be clear in terms of what you are proposing. If there is a majority for the SNP again in May, you think, and that will be on an independence platform, you think that independence referendum should be allowed?
Well, I'm campaigning for Scottish Labour to win seats. I don't want an SNP majority, but you're asking a hypothetical question, and politicians usually try and dodge them. But my position is
it's not that hypothetical, is it, really, Monica? I mean, if we just want to be straight.
Answer, Joe, if you let me answer, it's hard down the line. If people in Scotland want a referendum, people in Scotland should get a referendum. So that's a democratic response. But we don't know the outcome of the election. But of course it should be for people in Scotland to choose. It shouldn't be settled in Westminster.
All right. Well, Shona is with us. You must welcome what Monica is saying there about her position on a second independence referendum.
Yes, so let me start by agreeing with Monica Lennon that it's for the Scottish people to decide their future. I mean, opposition politicians have a right to argue against independence, but I don't think they have a right to argue that it should be the Scottish people deciding their future in a referendum. So I would welcome Monica Lennon's position on that. And if the SNP win a majority in the Holyrood elections in May, then that's exactly what will happen. You can't stop democracy. You can't stop the voice of the people being heard. And I'm confident that voice will be heard loud and clear in May.
Right. Well, Andrew, are you listening?
I'm listening loud and clear. And what I think we've just seen there between Monica and Shona is that the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish National Party are basically two sides of the same coin. And to listen to Monica, it's no surprise that Labour are now falling further and further behind the Scottish Conservatives and demonstrating that they will never be a solid opposition to the Scottish National Party. There's only one party left in Scotland now that opposes another referendum, and actually stands up for Scotland's place at full square at the centre of our United Kingdom, and that's the Scottish Conservative Party. I will argue with Shona Robeson till I'm blue in the face, I'm sure, about the values and the merits of independence versus being a part of the United Kingdom. But Labour's position is just simply uncredible. I mean, to say that it's for the Scottish people to decide, and so therefore we won't take a position, but that we would back another referendum, but that we want to be in the United Kingdom, but we don't quite know what that we want the future of the United Kingdom to look like, isn't going to wash with the Scottish people. They want to know what Labour stands for, and they just simply don't know, which is why they are now the third party in Scotland.
Monica?
Well, Andrew's saying quite a lot there, but what people in Scotland want to know, for example, the Scottish Affairs Committee report, Andrew, that had recommendations for Boris Johnson's government on tackling Scotland's drug death crisis. Where is that report? Why is it in a drawer? So what people are saying is we want further powers in Scotland over drugs law, over employment law. your party won't even have that discussion. You're the party that's shutting down debate and democracy. It's all very well rolling out Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson has no real interest in Scotland. It's Boris Johnson who's harming the union. I want to stay in the union. I want to reform the union. Where are your proposals for reform, Andrew?
Well, Monica, firstly, on drugs, the Scottish Government already has a whole swathe of public health powers that it could use to combat the absolutely abhorrent state of drugs policy in Scotland and the shocking level of drug deaths that we have in Scotland. That is a direct responsibility of the Scottish Government's failure to act. And on the other issues, I can't even remember what Monica said there.
Well, the SNP's record is bad because they cut funding to alcohol and drug services, Andrew. But you've put a committee report by the Scottish Affairs Committee, MPs from Scotland, you've put that away. They're recommending decriminalisation. Do you support that? Do you support safe drug consumption rooms like the van in Glasgow that Peter Kiken is operating? Do you support that?
Let Andrew respond, and then I must get Shona back in.
Well, I don't actually support the introduction of safe consumption rooms. I think that their merits still need to be proven. I think we need to have a long, hard look at whether they actually do have the positive impact on drugs deaths that some people claim they do. I think more research is required in that area.
All right, Shona, do you want to... Hang on, Monica, because you both making assertions there about what the government in Scotland, the SNP, have or haven't done over drugs policy. Shona, do you want to respond directly?
Well, we've acknowledged, the First Minister has acknowledged that more needs to be done to address the drugs deaths crisis, and a statement was made by the First Minister herself. Additional money has gone in. There's going to be more rehabilitation, more community services, and a fundamental review of essentially what works. It is a huge problem here, and everybody's agreed that more needs to be done. More should have been done, absolutely, and I'll be the first to hold my hands up to that. But action is now being taken and is being given a top priority, and that is quite right. But, Andrew Bowie is, essentially saying that 21 polls in a row supporting independence for Scotland, that the Scottish people are wrong, are to be denied their democratic choice over their future. That is so inherently undemocratic, and it won't stand. It won't stand from Andrew Bowie, and it won't stand from any of the Tories. The will of the Scottish people will prevail, and once this pandemic is over, there will be a legally held referendum.
Right, OK, Andrew?
Sorry, well, I'm glad that Shona recognises we've got a problem with drug deaths in Scotland. Obviously, she was Health Minister for quite a long time in the Scottish National Party government.
Yeah, I know you want to stick on this, but we want to get on to the issue that Shona's talking about. There are 20 polls that have said people want Scottish independence.
Yes, I was about to come to that. It says we're stymieing the democratic will of the people. Well, I don't know where Shona or Monica were in 2014, but I was out campaigning in a referendum where 55% of Scots voted to remain in the United Kingdom. That was only 6.5 years ago. I don't think we can move too far away from that, because that quite clearly was a democratic event. The people of Scotland voted in large numbers to remain a part of the United Kingdom. And on the 20 polls in a row, yes, I absolutely accept that the campaign for independence...
So your strategy's not working, is it?
Well, I don't know about that. In the four polls that I've seen lately, the support for independence seems to be going backwards. Today in the latest poll,
Andrew, I'm showing everybody, the viewers, this graph, polls on Scottish independence, and there are 20 polls in a row, maybe 21 polls in a row, showing that support for Scottish independence has not only gone up but is in the majority. Now, it may have slipped very slightly, but that is still the case. Your hardball strategy isn't succeeding.
Well, as I said, the last four polls are showing it's going backwards. The latest poll today showed that support was under 50%, a long way off the 60% that Nicola Sturgeon herself said in 2016 she would be comfortable with in going for another referendum. I'm very confident that when it came to it, the Scottish people would see the benefits of remaining in our United Kingdom. But fundamentally, Joe, we are in the middle of a pandemic right now. We should be focusing on recovery and on rebuilding this country, getting people back to work, getting the economy back up and running. We shouldn't be talking about another divisive referendum on independence with all the uncertainty that would bring for people's lives, for business and for everything else. What we should be focused on right now is A, the vaccine rollout, and B, getting our country back on its feet. All the rest is a distraction.
Shona?
Well, today's poll showed 53% in favour of independence, and the First Minister has been focused on the pandemic. She does daily briefings and has said very clearly it's a top priority and there would only be a referendum after the pandemic. But, you know, Andrew and his Tory friends and government are in a total panic here. They've even set up a union unit, spending hundreds of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money to try and rebut the case for independence. So they're running scared because they know the will of the Scottish people can't be stopped. There will be a referendum. I'm confident that the people will vote yes in that referendum.
Right, Shona, you are confident that there'll be a referendum. Ian Blackford, the leader of the SNP in Westminster, says it must happen this year. Is that right?
Well, it'll happen after the pandemic is over. Now, it's hard to exactly pinpoint when that will be clearly, but the First Minister has been clear it will be after the pandemic is over. And that's quite right and proper because all of our focus of the Scottish Government is on dealing with that. But after that, then, yes, there will be a referendum if the SNP has a mandate in May, which obviously we're working hard to get, then there will be a referendum and that will be at the time after the pandemic.
I'm going to get the others in, but just briefly, but Ian Blackford, we're showing people the headline in the National. It is from November last year, but he says IndyRef 2 will be held next year. That's this year, says Ian Blackford. But you're saying it might not. If the end of the pandemic, there's a long tail, it could be the year after.
Well, I'm certainly hopeful it would be this year, but clearly we have to wait until after the pandemic, and that's hard to be exact about. But I'm hopeful it will be as soon as it is safe to do so after the pandemic, and I'm confident that we will win that referendum.
OK, Madeleine and George. But Madeleine, first of all, I mean, this is crunch point, isn't it, really, this year over this issue, this constitutional issue. And to some extent, Shona is right that the government could be described as running scared on this. On the other hand, the government has always said that it was a once, responding to SNP leader and former leaders, saying it was a once-in-a-generation referendum in 2014. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I can see both sides of the argument. I myself am very passionately unionist. I'd be absolutely heartbroken if Scotland were to break away as an independent country. But equally, I'm also a Democrat and I can see the arguments for having a referendum, given that quite a lot has changed since 2014. However, I do think that there needs to be a level of security for people to know that these democratic outcomes, there could be some kind of peace of mind in between these big votes so that people can get on with normal life in the interim. I do feel right now that the SNP are very much turning up the dial on this, partly as a means of distracting from the great litany of scandals that they're currently engulfing the party internally, and also to distract from some of the domestic issues, the way that they've handled aspects of the pandemic. I just think it was so typical of the SNP that they are pushing for division at a time of extraordinary turmoil elsewhere, at a time when people want to come together again. You know, last month, as Scottish GPs were raising concerns about slower rates of vaccination north of the border, the for, helping kids at school catch up, but for independence, absolutely every issue, anything and everything returns to the issue of Scottish independence. And I think at that point, I know that in the polls, the SNP does extremely well, as what Alex Massey calls the Nicola Sturgeon effect, where nothing ever seems to stick. In fact, the worse the performance domestically, the better they do in the opinion polls. But I do think that at some point, people will start to see through the obvious opportunism of constantly banging independence drum to distract from their own failures.
George, I promise I will come to you in a moment, but Shona, you must respond to what you've just heard, the litany of scandals, etc., from Madeleine.
Well, first of all, over 1 million people have now been vaccinated and the vaccination programme is motoring on and is doing well. And it's really important that the focus has been on the pandemic. And actually, one of the reasons we want the powers of independence is to help our recovery from the pandemic so that we have the economic powers that we need to make sure that we can deliver a recovery from the pandemic that we require in Scotland. At the moment, we just don't have those powers. So the two are very much linked.
George, I said that you would be able to comment on this, and you can. And perhaps you would also take in the fact that divisions within the SNP have been highlighted by one of their own, Joanna Cherry, who was sacked from the front bench, saying there's unprecedented turmoil in the party at the moment.
Well, yes, of course, that distinguishes the SNP from all the other parties in the United Kingdom. Look, if I lived in Scotland I would want to get out of this chaotic, dysfunctional, corrupt union as quickly as I could. And the same applies to Wales, the same applies to Northern Ireland. I can't see the point of staying in the United Kingdom, of being chained to the United Kingdom like a block of concrete as the boat begins to founder. Because, you know, the promise given to Scotland was, if you stay in the Union, you will have stability. If you become independent, it'll be chaotic. If you stay in the Union, you'll have political choice. You'll be able to have a stable currency. You'll be part of something which will allow you to punch above your weight on the global stage. All of that. All of those promises have been busted by Brexit. And it seems to me that in both straightforward instrumental terms and in ideological terms, Scotland would be much better off out of the United Kingdom and in the European Union.
All right.
Same for Wales, same for reunification in Ireland.
All right, well, unsurprisingly, although you can't see it, strong reaction from Andrew.
Yeah, well, frankly, I think that's nonsense. There are 1 million people in Scotland today who have jobs because Scotland is a part of the United Kingdom, and the furlough scheme, which was supported by the weight of HM Treasury, the Westminster government, stepping in when people most needed it to support them in the darkest days of this pandemic. That shows the strength of the union in action. There are businesses open today in Scotland because of the action taken by the Westminster government. We are functioning as a country because this Westminster government stood in and took the action required to support Scotland through a very, very tough time. The broad shoulders of our four nations working together, and to blithely say that Scotland would be better off, and so would Wales, and so would a reunified Ireland outside the United Kingdom, and frankly, is to misunderstand the issues, to misunderstand the problems, to misunderstand the views of a huge number of Scots who see their home and see their place of belonging as being a part of the United Kingdom, the fifth largest economy in the world, and everything that brings in terms of benefits to this country.
Brief response, George.
Well, I mean, being ruled by Westminster is bad enough if you live in England. But having this bunch of elite people who really have no contact, even with most of those in England, telling you what to do when you're in Scotland, I would find that intolerable.
All right, we are going to leave it there.
I happen to be speaking from Scotland, living in Scotland right now. So the idea that we are some sort of elite who have no interaction with...
You're a part of that elite. You're a part of that corrupt, dysfunctional Westminster government. Why should you not? Why should you feel any differently?
Well, I'm not even going to bother responding to that.
All right, well, that does bring us to the end of that discussion. Shona, thank you very much for joining us today. And, of course, we will return to this issue again shortly. Now, we're going to talk about something completely different. I want to show you this headline in the Times newspaper. New carbon taxes. Meat, cheese and gas heating prices to rise. Now, this is a leaked document, but there's clearly a discussion going on at the moment. The Prime Minister reportedly is ordering every department to produce a price for carbon emissions across all areas of the economy as part of the commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions pledge. And as you will know, the UK is hosting the COP26 Environmental Conference in the autumn in Glasgow. Madeleine, should we work out the carbon cost of all aspects of the economy and tax it accordingly?
In general, I'm a big fan of carbon tax. I think it's a much, much better, more efficient way of responding to climate change by getting emitters to pay directly for their activity. That seems a far better way of managing things than attempting to get bureaucrats to devise these ever more complicated ways of discouraging people from using carbon and often getting it catastrophically wrong. But I'm not convinced that now is exactly the right time to be bringing in these measures. It would probably be the case that these measures would be hitting households at a time of high unemployment after the biggest economic contraction in recent history. And when you consider that because of the pandemic, many high-emitting activities such as, overseas travel, holidays, etc., have ground to a halt anyway, I would be tempted to give the taxpayer a bit of a break here, but certainly to consider this as the right model going forward to dealing with the crisis of climate change.
George?
Well, look, the crisis of climate change, or climate breakdown, as it should properly be called, is much, much bigger than the pandemic. And the issues that we're facing at the moment, horrendous as they are dwarfed by the scale of the issues that climate breakdown threatens if we don't get to grips with it very quickly indeed. And so, yes, we have to take the most effective measures, but that It's not a choice between fiscal measures and regulatory measures. We need both. And we need the government to be taking this issue as seriously as it should be taking the pandemic. I was going to say as it is taking the pandemic, but actually we've seen horrendous failures there.
All right, George, yes, you've self-corrected, yeah.
Okay, but and so, yes, absolutely. We need to see the costs which particular industries impose on the world reflected by the prices that we're paying. But before we even go there, you know, if we're talking about meat taxes, first of all, let's remove the subsidies. You know, meat production in this country receives more subsidies than any other agricultural sector because they're paid by the hectare and meat takes up the vast majority of agricultural land. Let's remove the subsidies before we start taxing, and then we can start talking about other sensible fiscal measures.
Monica?
I think I agree with almost everything that George has said there. I mean, it's good to hear that Boris Johnson's taken the climate seriously, climate breakdown, but perhaps that's just to have good things to say ahead of COP26, which I'm glad is happening in Glasgow. Yeah. But we do need a just transition because we do need to shift away from industries that are bad for people and the planet, but it shouldn't be the poorest people that have to pay the price for that. In Scotland, fuel poverty is a massive, massive issue. Right. I'm not sure what Andrew wants to do about that, but we need people earning decent wages, living in homes that are fit for the 2020s because people are wasting money. But Monica, would you be prepared to tell your constituents that they might have to pay more for meat, for example, or cheese if these carbon taxes went on agriculture? Well, I think some of these proposals sound quite regressive and it would put the burden onto consumers, many of them who are low earners, middle earners who are struggling just to manage right now. So I think what George has talked about in terms of looking at how we subsidise industry, how we can diversify industry, because we need a just transition on this. But as someone who's been vegetarian since the age of 13, which wasn't yesterday, there's other ways to promote people to change lifestyle and to change, you know, their own behaviours. OK, well, Andrew, let's get your view. Carbon taxes on meat. Good idea?
Well, I mean, we are not going to be introducing a meat tax. That is categorically not going to happen. But I actually agree with George to a certain extent. I think a lot of farmers, especially in Scotland, would be quite worried at the thought of subsidies being removed in their entirety. As you can see behind me on the map, I represent a very rural constituency with many farmers in it. However, on leaving the Common Agricultural Policy, which Brexit has allowed us to do, we can now build a new framework, one that takes into account all the environmental concerns and the bespoke needs of the British farmer and how we combat climate change in a much more sensitive and managed way here in the United Kingdom. The Common Agricultural Policy was a disaster for the environment by the way that it actually managed the subsidies. And I think that Scottish and the wider British farming community understand that and look forward to a new regime which is sensitive to their needs, works for them and is also much better for the environment. Right, George, just briefly, we haven't got long left on the show.
Yes, he's right about the Common Agricultural Policy. Total disaster. We do need a complete reform of farm subsidies, but part of that has to be a shift away from meat, which is as damaging to the climate as coal. Right. Well, Madeleine, what's your view? No carbon taxes on meat, says Andrew.
I don't have a problem with industries that are heavy emitters paying, or consumers of heavy emitting products paying directly for their use of that. I think that is by far the most efficient way of doing it. So in principle, I would not be opposed to a meat tax. I think that ultimately, if the alternative is centralised bureaucratic tinkering that makes people's bills go up whilst perhaps not having that desired effect, I would much prefer the streamlined way of managing things through a direct carbon tax.
Right. Well, there you go, Andrew.
I'm sorry, the Zoom cut out there. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Well, actually, do you know what?
Madeleine said.
Do you know what? We've run out of time, so you won't get to answer that question. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you to all of our guests. We are away next week because it is parliamentary recess, so you won't be seeing these people for a little while. We will be back on Monday, the 22nd at 12:15, so please do join me then. Bye-bye.